We are looking at a 5,000 share order.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Google Cloud Live. I am Shubham Saboo, Senior AI Product Manager at Google. I work on ADK and the open ecosystem. Joining me is Chris Overholt, Developer Relations Engineer at Google. Chris, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hello, hey Shubham, hey everyone, great to see you here. I'm Chris Overholt. I'm a developer relations engineer in Google Cloud, and I work with ADK and lots of AI and ML tools. I'm happy to dig into some of those today.
Awesome. We would love to know where you guys are joining from. So just drop a note in the chat where you guys are joining from. I am broadcasting from Sunnyvale, California, and Chris is over in Austin. And today we'll be talking about our favorite topic, Agent Development Kit. And we'll be specifically going over the tools and integrations part, something that we recently added, I would say expanded across the ecosystem. So, Chris, for people who haven't used ADK much or who haven't dug into the ADK docs for a while, can you give a quick rundown of what's changed and maybe start with what ADK actually is, what ADK means?
Yeah, absolutely. So ADK is Agent Development Kit, and we released this as a Google open source project just under a year ago. And so what it is, it's a framework that you can use to prototype and build and deploy AI agents. Those agents can use Gemini, they can use other models. It's a very open sort of ecosystem and design, and it's really designed to make agent development look like software development. So we have very minimal boilerplate. You can spin up an agent, point it to Gemini 3.1 models, give it a few tools, and you can add functionality from there. The other thing worth mentioning is our first release. We released the Python version of ADK. And then throughout all of last year, we actually have 4 languages that you can use ADK in now. So there's Python and Java and Go and TypeScript. So you can pick your favorite language and prototype an agent. And depending on how you're using it, you can deploy that agent. You can use it locally. It's a lot of flexibility. And then today we'll be talking about the ecosystem of integrations that make something like ADK even better. So you can connect it to external systems like databases and different text to speech engines and all kinds of cool knowledge bases.
That's awesome, Chris. Just want to highlight that the multi-language support is what really makes ADK stand out, and along with the open source model agnostic nature. So of course you can use ADK with Gemini, but you can also use it with Claude, OpenAI models, even open source models through Light LLM. And today we are going to talk about the architectural control that ADK provides to build your agents. And we really want to skip over the hello world examples. That's generally the most talked about because we know like that is something that you guys can go in, look at the docs. Our docs team has done a great job. Can find that, can run it in less than 2 minutes. So today what we are going to cover is how to move beyond those hello world prototypes, how to build agents that's actually usable in productions, how to connect tools, how to connect third party integrations with your agents, and how to make them reliable. Because when we are having conversations with engineering teams building agents, especially in enterprises, especially with customers, one thing that generally comes up is agents. Okay, it's easy to start, it's good, but generally, but sometimes it's not super reliable, and people are still trying to figure out how to stop writing massive fragile blocks of code that just fall apart in production. So we are going to cover all of that. We are going to see how we can solve the headaches of managing a multi-step tool execution loop, how we can gracefully recover an external API drop while keeping the context intact for our agents. So Chris, why don't we just start and talk about what we are going to cover today?
Yeah, absolutely. So today we're going to cover how to build agents with ADK, specifically agents that connect to external systems. And we're going to show you a number of things. We'll show you like a really fast, streamlined way to do that. This is part of our growing integrations and tools in ADK. So it makes it really easy to like take an integration that you already want to, you want to use. Like we'll show connecting to GitHub, connecting to Hugging Face, tools you already use in your day-to-day workflows, and you think, hey, wouldn't it be cool if I built an agent that connected to GitHub and then retrieved models from Hugging Face and wrote to my Notion, right? So this is like a really common request. Just like you said, people start with the hello world agent and they're like, hey, I really need to connect this to my data, my systems, my tools. So we'll show you how to do that. And we'll kind of show the end to end of like, we'll start with an agent. And we know a lot of people are like vibe coding and vibe engineering things. So we'll show you how to do that with ADK. And you can plug into our docs. And that way you don't need to have, 20 tabs open, one with multi-agent architectures, one with MCP tools. Like you can actually point your agent with skills or MCP doc server to our ADK docs. So we'll kind of start simple and put together an agent that has a few tools, but the real focus is making your agent useful by reaching out to these systems that you use every single day. So I like to think about it like I usually have a bunch of tabs for GitHub open and I'm like researching things on Hugging Face. Like if I could enable my agent to do that same thing, how do I do that? And how do I quickly enable that without having to like write APIs and things like that manually? So we'll kind of show that end to end, but really what we're going to show mostly today is just doing really cool stuff with agents that you used to take, a few days or weeks to build out. And we're going to do some of that like live right here and show you like, hey, it's really easy to plug into these systems, especially using our growing integration ecosystem.
That's awesome, Chris. And if I see like how I code these days, I really don't go into docs much and write the code myself. There's like a lot of syntax boilerplate. So I think what we really want to show users today or show the developers today is how you can really get started in less than 2 minutes. How you can actually have an agent, a coding agent, build agents for you. So the best part of this live stream is that we are going to show you how to code with AI agent itself, how to build agents using our new coding with AI workflows. And Chris, how are we injecting ADK expertise directly into the IDE, anti-gravity IDE today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll actually pull up my screen and I'll show you some of the ADK documentation and how there's a couple of really powerful ways you can do that. So if you're using ADK, and what you said is exactly right. So a lot of the agentic coding tools are like really nice to get started with, but often people pick them up, they start asking it like, "Hey, go build an agent, use ADK," and they really quickly find that even the latest models will like hallucinate and some of the methods and different capabilities inside of the framework. So there's different ways that you can feed kind of the latest information into your coding environment. And this includes things like Gemini CLI, anti-gravity, which we'll show in a second, Cursor, Claude Code, all these different tools, right? They have been adopting these standards. One of them is Skills and one of them is MCP. So what you said is exactly right. People are no longer really going to documentation, reading page by page, which, as working in developer relations is like kind of sad that there's not much, people looking at the documentation. But the good news is both us developers and users actually really care about documentation. Skills are documentation. MCP is pulling from documentation. So if I go to the Agent Development Kit homepage, we actually have a page dedicated to this. If you go to Build Agents and Coding with AI, one of these is like really, really new, and you should absolutely try out our ADK Dev Skills. And there's another method you can use to plug into the Docs MCP. So just a really quick overview of what those two things are. You've probably heard of skills. They're ways of teaching your own coding or productivity agents how to do something. So we released something called ADK Dev Skills, and it's a collection of like 6 core skills from a cheat sheet, dev guide, observability guide. And you can actually install them with one command, and it'll pull the latest skills from our repo. And you can actually browse and see like what these skills are doing. So there's a dev guide, and if you dig into one of these skills, you can see it has a lot of like patterns and best practices. And also it has live links to the documentation throughout. So if there's something that the agent can kind of progressively discover, like I need to learn how to make a multi-agent, and then I need to look up, the latest code for connecting to GitHub or something like that. So that's how skills work. And you can install these skills inside of your project folder, and then they'll be discovered by your Gemini CLI, your anti-gravity, or your other tools, right? So that's skills. The other way that you can use is the Docs MCP server. So in ADK Docs, we actually publish LLMs.txt, and we publish all of our pages automatically as Markdown. So we want to be super friendly to coding agents. And so what you can do is there are instructions, like for example, anti-gravity. You basically copy this JSON block, and it will enable a Docs MCP server that will allow your anti-gravity agent to search docs and read docs. So if you're asking questions like, how do I add an MCP server? How do I add a plugin or a callback? It'll retrieve those, and then it'll have the latest information. Every time we push a docs update, we update all of this stuff. So you'll know that you're using the latest and greatest, especially for a lot of the integration code samples that we're showing today. So do yourself a favor, save yourself like hours of frustration and prompting and fixing hallucinations, and just pick one of these methods, turn it on, and then everything we're doing today, you can actually reproduce in your environment and say, hey, make an agent that connects to GitHub and Hugging Face and Notion, and it'll pull all of this latest info. So those are the two ways you can use. And in a few minutes, I'll actually show you one of those live.
That is so cool. I think the easiest way, again, just to recap to get started, is just one command install. And I just want to highlight this here. You can install agent skills and any of your IDE, be it Cursor, Anti-Gravity, Cloud Code, Gemini CLI, they'll just automatically pick these things up. And this is all the knowledge that we have collected as an ADK team, as ADK Engine team, on the best practices to build agent. So think of it like you'll have an expert ready right with you, just ready to get started at the command of your prompt. So you just put in a prompt, whatever you want to build, and here is an expert which just works with you to get it done. It completely removes the initial learning curve. So you can get a fully working agent in less than 2 minutes. Just enter the prompt in the coding agent and you get it there. So without further ado, Chris, why don't we spin up our IDE and show them how easy and how quick it is to build their first agent?
Yeah, that's a great idea. And so we can probably do it faster than it took me to explain what those methods were, right? This stuff is really cool and cutting edge. So if I open up anti-gravity, I'll just show really quickly what this step looks like. So you can install skills, or you can enable a Docs MCP server. They're kind of two different methods of doing kind of the same thing. And so in my anti-gravity config, if I go to the settings, MCP servers, and I click this manage MCP servers button, there is a way that you can view the raw config, and that 16-line config is exactly what we have in our docs here. And all it's really doing is saying, hey, I'm going to give you an MCP server, and I'm going to point you to the latest and greatest ADK docs, right? So I did that. I've enabled that, and you can see I have two new tools now, list doc sources and fetch docs. So now what I can do is I can pull up a new agent on the side here. Let's go back to the agent, and I can plug in a prompt and say, hey, let's create a multi-agent system on our desktop. We want to use ADK Python, and I want a root agent that delegates to two sub-agents, one that generates a short summary and another that translates that summary into Spanish. Each agent should use Gemini 3 Flash Preview, and I told it to kind of use the project structure that ADK has defined. So with that prompt, I can send that to my coding agent in anti-gravity, and it is now going to pull those docs tools, and it's going to make a couple of queries. So it knows it needs to query about multi-agent setups. It knows that it needs to look up documentation for basically how do I make a root agent with sub-agents. And so this is sort of like the agent reading all of those docs for me. And then at some point, it's going to spit back a plan, and I can read through that plan and make sure that's what we want, and we'll code our agent. And so One thing I'll mention too, while this is running and planning, is Gemini 3 models have come out recently, right? So we have Gemini 3.1 Pro, Gemini 3.1 Flash Lite, and then Gemini 3 Flash. And so ADK works with all of these, right? So out of the box. So you don't have to do any special tweaks or tuning or anything. What I like to do personally when I'm developing, like, especially really complex agents, is I like to start with the pro models and really see what the agent is capable of. And then later on, I can take some of those sub agents and kind of optimize and say, hey, this translation step, like maybe I can convert that to Flash Lite and start kind of optimizing later on. But just so you know, they, like Shubham said, yeah, you can plug into Gemini 3 models today, or you can plug into other models. We have a bunch of pages on like Olama. This thing is, we've really designed ADK to be open and let you work how you want to. And so, yeah, so our coding agent has an implementation plan, and it says, hey, we're going to make a summarizer agent, a translator agent, a root agent. And we've approved that plan, and it's going to start coding up. So there's our init, our end, and our agent.py. And so it's writing all this code for me. And the main thing is it's adhering to all of the like best practices that are in the documentation. So let's see, let's accept some of these edits. And so we can see, I'm going to run this and see what we have. So we have a summarizer agent. We have a translator agent with Gemini 3 Flash Preview. And then we have a root agent coordinator. And so this all should work. And let us go to our terminal. I'm going to run. So now that it's created the agent on my desktop, I can start ADK. So there's a number of different ways that you can run ADK. You can run it through a web interface. You can run it through the command line with ADK run. You can run it as an API server, which is really handy for testing and deploying agents for consumption by a custom front end. So we're going to use ADK web. I'm going to go to the translation agent. And if I go and give it a topic here, so let's say, give me a summary of transformer models. So what this should do is it should invoke, it should generate a summary, and it should generate a translation. So it did exactly that. So we already, with like less than a couple of minutes of vibe coding, we have a multi-agent system that does our summary on a given topic and a translation. So it really is that easy to just plug in skills or plug in the Docs MCP server, and we have our multi-agent system. So that's like, we've come a long way from Hello Worlds, right? Like this is pretty impressive that we have this. And then throughout this session, we're going to add more integrations and tools to do even more powerful things. But that's it, Shubham. Like that, literally one prompt, multi-agent, pretty awesome.
Yeah. It took almost 2 minutes.
There you go.
No more than that. Yeah. I think, Chris, if you go back to the ADK web, I think it would make sense to just spend 30 seconds quickly talking about what are these different tabs. Like, of course, I can run my agent, chat with that, and I can get the output. But on the left side, I see trace, state, artifacts. I think it would be good to share it with the audience, like what these different tabs are, what they do, and how they can use them.
Yeah, that's a great point, because at first glance you say, well, this is just a chat UI, but really this is actually a really important development tool, and ADK Web is made for developing and tracing and doing evaluations. So it's a good point. And also, as we go throughout the session and we start plugging in more powerful tools, you'll see there's a lot of stuff in here to introspect, like what's going on behind the scenes. So what you're looking at is the ADK Web development interface, and you can start a new session. You can give it a prompt, and on the back end, it'll run your agent. And on the left panel, it will show you your invocations. And so this is really important for profiling and timing, getting your latencies down. And it'll actually show you, what, if you trace through these steps, what calls were made to subagents, what calls were made, and what came back from the model. So those are your kind of traces to see like what happened in what order when I gave a prompt to my agent. Because behind the scenes, there's usually a lot of sub steps that are happening. There's also state variables. We're not using them for this, but we will use them in later examples. So we can hold on to state and say, like, here are my research topics. Here's the latest research. So they're kind of like things that you want to hold on to throughout the user session, maybe for personalization, or so the user doesn't have to repeat themselves over and over. One other thing I'll point out is we have the idea of session IDs and user IDs. So ADK comes out of the box with user management, session management. You can plug those into like very scalable backends, so you can have multi-user agents. And one last thing worth calling out is evaluation. We're not going to go into detail on that today, but this is a really powerful way to evaluate your agent, because after all, you can make a fancy agent, but if it doesn't actually do what you need to do, what use is it of to you? So you can create evaluation sets. And I could say, like, hey, let me throw 10 different topics and let me check the final translation and see, like, is it summarizing the topic well? Is it breaking down somewhere in there, or is it breaking down at the translation step? So all in all, ADK Web is like a really fast and visual way to see traces, eval, state, all that stuff without having to like do everything in the terminal. And it's just one way of like quickly prototyping and working with ADK.
That's a great explanation. And for the audience on the live stream, just because we really like you, we want to leave you with something fun and interesting. So if you click the plus icon here, you might get into something called an agent designer, where you can visualize your agent team. And this is something that you can explore in your time. We are not going to cover it today, but something really fun to try out, something the team is building right now, and something that we have built for you to just visualize how the agent teams are working. And you don't just visualize, you can even build with it. Yeah, Chris is showing the doc. This is the visual agent builder, where you can see this drag and drop way to build the agents. You can also provide the natural language commands on the side in the assistant to build your agent team, configure. So this is like really handy and like no-brainer way to build agents. Like, you don't even have to get into code. You build this visually through this no-code interface, and then you can either export the code, run it directly via ADK Web. So this makes it even easier for you to build agents. Moving back, now the thing that we really want to talk about. Okay, building agents is great. We built our first agent using the dev skills and MCP in anti-gravity, but ultimately an agent is only capable as the systems it can interact with. And thank you, Chris, for bringing that up, because what we did in the last few months is went ahead and brought up all your favorite tools and integrations into the ADK system. To give you the sense of a scale, we have categorized this ecosystem into a few core categories. So for code and development, you can connect your agents to GitHub, GitLab, Postman, Restate. There's Daytona for code execution sandboxes. For project management, for project managers, we have direct connections to Asana, Atlassian, Linear, and Notion. And these are like super easy to connect, and Chris will show you as we move further down the live stream. It works via MCP, so just like one command or just a few lines of code, and you can just have it in your agent, and your agent can talk to these tools. We also have databases like Chroma, MongoDB, Pinecone, Vertex Search. Uh, then we also have memory layers like GoodMem, Quadrant, along with Google's Vertex AI memory bank. And once you deploy all of these, the critical part becomes observability. And even for observability, we have a, s- a- a number of partners which you can use from uh, whatever you like Agent Ops, AriseAX, FreePlay, MLflow, weights and biases. And if you need to reach other apps, here's something even more interesting. You can even connect your agents to something like N8N or Stack One, which opens the door for hundreds of SaaS apps. So now your agent can trigger automated workflows using N8N, which makes it really interesting for the no-code, low-code audience as well. And the last thing I want to point out is we have also integrated ADK with Hugging Face for you to discover not just like these tools and take action, but also discover AI models, data sets, and make your agents more and more interesting. And we're going to have a demo with Hugging Face soon, which is going to be super interesting. Then we have integrations from PayPal and Stripe for payments. And speech and audio, we are covering Cartesia and 11 Labs. So you can just make your agents really interesting, give them voice and give them a personality. And lastly, what we added was agent inboxes. So you can also give inboxes to your agents. That is like super fun. We have agent mail and mailgun, which acts as an email and messaging services for your agent. But listing categories only goes so far. The real fun begins when you integrate one or two or three of these tools together, do something really interesting. So today we have 3 demos lined up that combine these specific integrations. First, we'll wire up Hugging Face with GitHub and Notion to build an AI research scout. And all 3 of those tools are super easy to connect to your agents and they work seamlessly together. Chris will show you how quickly you can do it. Secondly, we'll look at a coding agent that uses Chroma for memory and Daytona for execution. And finally, we'll get into a multi-agent system where we'll have agents which will have their own inbox via agent mail connected to N, and they'll have use Cartesia for voice to build a team of parallel researchers that will turn into a podcast. So let's jump in right into the first one. Chris, why don't you show us how to build the Hugging Face, GitHub, and Notion Research Scout that uses all of those 3 tools together?
Yeah, perfect. Let's do it. Let's do it together and we'll kind of build these out one piece at a time. And you'll kind of see, it's interesting, Shubham. You remember a few months ago when you and I started this list
Mhm.
was essentially empty.
Yeah.
And so it's actually really cool to see like dozens and dozens of tools that are actually so different, right? So I found a lot of power in, not only connecting your agent to one tool, but connecting it to multiple tools. You don't realize how much glue work we do as humans of like taking information from one place and putting it in another. So the first example is a really good example of exactly that problem. So let me clean up here a little bit, and let's look at the research scout. And so this is a really common task for agents is, we realize that as humans, we like do a Google search on something and start reading individual articles and making notes about it. One of the biggest use of agents is like research and consolidating that down and notating that in a much faster and wider reach than you can do on your own manually, right? So this agent is, if you go to any of those integration pages, so we'll start with GitHub. Let's say that we want an ADK agent that can connect to GitHub. And why would you do this? You want it to be able to search code. You want it to look up issues and repos you care about or maintain. You want to review PRs. Basically, any of the dozens of things you can do in GitHub's UI or API, you want your agent to do that. So if you go to that documentation page, we have code samples for Python and TypeScript that are ready to go. And because they're MCP, right, they're abstracted away from whatever ADK language that you're developing with. So you can actually grab any of these code snippets. These are all tested by us and validated with our partners. And you can grab one of these code snippets and put it into your agent and then build on that. So that's exactly what I did. I basically went to the GitHub page and then the Hugging Face page and then the Notion page. Or you can ask your favorite coding agent, point it to our ADK docs, and have it build that out and say, hey, I want an agent that can connect to GitHub, Hugging Face, and Notion. And so this is what you end up with. It's pretty amazing. This is like 60 lines of code. And when you see what it can do, it's actually really, really impressive in how few lines of code this is. So I won't read through line by line, but I will highlight 2 things, the prompt and the tools. So here we're giving our research scout. This is just a single agent design. We're using Gemini 3.1 Pro preview, and you can see where you can flip the model right here. And we're saying, hey, let's let this agent search Hugging Face for trending models and papers, scan GitHub repos that actually use those models, and then create a research briefing page in Notion that has findings, link, and recommendations. So again, this is something you like might do. I don't know, you kind of set aside a day to do research and learn things and try things out. But it's even quicker to have an agent like search these 3 places and kind of form this little pipeline for you. So in the tools part of this, I've basically taken those code snippets. So this is the MCP tool set to connect to GitHub using our token. This is the MCP tool set to connect to Hugging Face using our token. And this is the MCP tool set to connect to Notion with our token. So super simple. I really, really like these MCP servers because they're super easy to set up and prototype. And each one of them can have 10 or 20 or 30 tools behind it. So when you're in explore and prototype mode, this is like the fastest way to get started. So if I run this agent, let me go over and jump to our research scout. And I want to feed it a prompt now, right? So I want it to research the latest models for text to speech on Hugging Face, find the most active GitHub repos that are actually using those TTS models, and then create a briefing document in Notion that compares the model's quality, latency, and community adoption. So like this is kind of a, let's look at a bunch of unstructured information, like different models that are out there, different code repos, and let's bring it all into a structured report. So just from that prompt, I start to see a lot of tool calls that are happening. And remember, we plugged in those 3 providers. So if I click on one of these, I can actually see, okay, this is this is a big list of actions that are possible to do on Hugging Face, and then later it'll start doing that with GitHub and later with Notion. And you can see, like, I did not write any Python API code or API calls to actually do these things. It's pulling it all from these MCP integrations in ADK. So all of these tools are available. It has selected the hub repo search, the paper search, the API post search. And so this is kind of like the information gathering stage. And then if we click on one of these later tool calls, like number 7, we'll see it's doing search repository. So now it's switched from pulling information from Hugging Face. Now it's querying GitHub and searching repositories. And you can drill down all the way in these events and actually see like what search queries is it doing on GitHub and what search queries is it doing on Hugging Face in case you want to iterate on those a bit more. And then one of the last things it'll do, there we go. So in less than the time that I could explain it, like it actually completed a full round trip of Hugging Face, GitHub, and Notion. And so it gave me an executive summary. Like, here are the top trending TTS models by downloads. Here's what they do. Here's the GitHub adoption. Here's what the use case is for. And then the coolest part to me is, if I go, I can actually look up those models in Hugging Face, download them, look at all of the metadata for it. And then if I go into my Notion, I can see that it's written an entire report. So that was everything you saw, like the Hugging Face, the Notion page creation, all of that happened in that like 1 minute run that I just did, just by plugging in those few integration code samples. So super powerful. You can see all of the tool calls that it made along the way. And again, what I would do now is I would start to optimize, and I would start to say, like, is it calling the right things? Is it doing the right queries? Can we shrink down the latency? And then you can start to optimize and break this into sub agents. But all in all, for 60 lines of code, that is pretty awesome. What do you think, Shubham?
Oh yeah, that was a complete end-to-end research workflow, I would say, right?
Yeah.
You had GitHub, you had Hugging Face, you had Notion, and agent pulling in, and we should say like intelligently, right? You'd see the number
Yes.
of tool calls. If you would have to go, I don't know about you, Chris, like if I have to go and decide which of these Hugging Face tools and actions to use, I might definitely be confused. But here an agent is doing all that work behind the scenes. So that's super cool. And if you go back to IDE, one thing I really want to point the developers and users to is the definition of MCP toolset, right? How easy it is, even though it is 60 lines, but it is not even 60 lines, right? If you go like how we define each of these tools, the syntax pretty much remains same. All you're doing is just filling in the blank, like just changing the tool name. That's it. Everything else remains same. And the instruction is just your prompt, then you're just giving the model name. So super intuitive, even if you don't use a coding agent, if you want to learn this by writing it yourself, that is also super intuitive and easy. So kudos to the team for such clean structured code that they have built. And moving on, uh, now you saw like how you can build this research workflow, end-to-end research workflow in around 50-60 lines of code. Next thing you can do is really extend this with a simple cron job. So it's automated, it's doing it daily for you. So every day you wake up and you see this kind of research report drop to you via email, or just plug it into your Slack bot or Discord bot so your team can see it as well. So a lot of ways you can extend this kind of workflow. And we did it live on the stream. It took us less than 5 minutes, Chris, I would say. Yeah, five
Yeah.
minutes max. Yeah, that's awesome. uh, but we do not plan to stop here with single agent multi-tools. I think generating research reports is very useful. But what happens when you need your agent to write and execute code? Because that is also one of the most important application. Because what happens most of the times when you ask agent to write code and they have model, they end up hallucinating some command here and there. And if you're doing it on your machine, they might end up deleting your local directory or an important file, which could create a huge problem. So this is where we combine safe execution with semantic memory. This is where we'll have Daytona plugin come in, which provides your code sandbox. So it is a safe environment where you can go in and run your code. It isolates all the mistakes that agents make, and make sure it does not harm your important files. It does not do anything on your local machine. So you can still do all your wild experiments while keeping your files and directories safe. And then we have Chroma as a memory store to make sure the agent does not repeat the same mistake. Just like we humans learn from our memory, what we did yesterday, we won't repeat that day after. Similarly, we can provide this memory layer to agents. So anything that we do, any mistakes that they made along the journey, they could remember it and won't make the same mistake twice. And before we get into that, I said Daytona plugin. So I think it would be good to touch here what a plugin is in ADK. So far, we have been talking about tools. Everybody know tools, what that means, and everybody, I guess, know MCP, Model Context Protocol. But here we will be using Daytona plugin. Why plugin, Chris? Like, what is a plugin in ADK?
Yeah, it's a good point. There's different ways of extending ADK. Most of these are like implementation details that you as an agent builder don't need to worry about. This is more important if you're actually like a plugin developer trying to extend ADK. But it's worth knowing like what the difference is, especially people think of what can I do with MCP versus a plugin versus a callback. So what we showed for Hugging Face and GitHub and Notion were MCP tools. You can obviously also give your agent direct tools and define those in your agent. A plugin is just a way of packaging all of that up. And so if you see something like a plugin, it means that one of the partner organizations we work with, like Daytona or a number of others, have actually developed, like in this case, a Python package. And that Python package is made to play well and extend ADK in a very standardized way. What it means for you as a developer is there's hundreds of lines of code that you don't have to have in your agent. And I really, really like this documentation like this because it shows you install ADK, you pip install Daytona ADK plugin, you import it, plug in their API key, and now you have the power of like running your agent backend and code on a bunch of virtual machines in the cloud, right? Like really, really quickly. So it's a good point, and that if you're using an MCP tool or a plugin, mostly that means you're adding something to your agent. As you get as you start to build more complex agents, you'll probably find yourself looking, and maybe you'll even write your own plugins and publish them, or maybe write callbacks and you say, hey, every time the conversation finishes, I want to write this to Notion or write this to a memory store. So you can kind of progressively, you don't have to do it all at once. You'll kind of find yourself saying, oh, this is neat how they made a plugin. How do I write my own? You can look at the plugin docs and dig in. But the really cool thing is that we did a couple of months ago is we put all of those things in one place. So you just go here. You don't have to understand what a plugin versus MCP is. Just pick your favorite provider and try it out.
Yeah, I would just add like the best part for me when it comes to plugin is, and I haven't seen this with a lot of other frameworks. It really provides you as a developer the way to extend the core functionality of ADK without touching the core repo code. So you don't have to wait for the eng team to get your PR merged to have something in ADK. You can build your plugin on the side, and self-extend based on whatever you need. So this really makes ADK an open and flexible framework where you can really build the code and plugins that make sense for your use case and extend it without touching the core code ever, or without making changes to the core code. But back to you, Chris. Let's get
Yep.
into the demo.
Yeah, let's do it. And so I think I'll go kind of rapid fire through a couple of demos now that you all understand like the structure and the integrations. I want to like sort of light up your imagination with really cool things you can do, kind of like our first use case, right? But let's show something completely different. So in this example demo, I want to show two things. Code execution, and there's a number of different tools you can use for that, right? By default, the agent's going to try to run things on your machine. If you need to fan out and have really quick virtual secure sandboxes, there's a number of ways to do that. One is through our partner Daytona. And it's like you saw, this like 5 lines of code gives you access to Daytona's platform. So your ADK agent can talk to Daytona and run different code on there and get the results back. So let's make an agent that uses Daytona and that uses Chroma, right? So Shubham mentioned a number of different data storage layers or memory stores, vector stores. We have a lot of those connected here. Chroma is one of them, an open source embedding database. So one use case that's really neat is to use those two things together so let me pull that up. We have a code memory agent. And if I pull that open, I'll just show the prompt and the tools. So the prompt here is you're a coding agent with persistent memory. You store code snippets, patterns, and solutions in a Chroma collection so that whenever the user asks for something, you can look in that code pattern database and use this. So a really nice way to have your agents not waste tokens by like trying things over and over from the bottom up. Just like store what works, pull what works, and use it every time. And so two things you can plug into this, right? You can use you can build this in an infinite number of ways, but two things you can use for this is Daytona for the code execution and Chroma for actually storing those code samples. So the tools here are super short and sweet. So there is one MCP tool that talks to Chroma, and you can have it point to like a local Chroma database or point to a hosted managed Chroma instance. And then Daytona is super short and sweet. That's their Daytona plugin. And we add that to our list of tools via their plugin spec. So once you do that, if we jump over to ADK, let's go to our code memory agent, and in there, I'm going to tell it to. I'm going to be a little bit verbose just so you can see how this thing works. But basically, I'll say, I want you to remember this pattern for generating synthetic data and computing group statistics or descriptive statistics with pandas, kind of like a classic data science workflow or machine learning workflow, and then tag it with this language Python with this purpose. And so it is going to store this in Chroma. And then the next time I ask this question, our agent should be able to just pull that and use that from its known list of good patterns, right? So if I say, I want you to use data patterns you have stored and generate a synthetic data set with 5,000 rows, print a summary table. I think I'm going to restart. Oh, you know what? I forgot to install something. Dev problems. But anyway, what this would do is generate Python code and run that. Maybe I'll try it in a couple of minutes here. And so it will store all of the code in there, run it on Daytona, get back the result. So you're not just looking at what the LLM thought the answer might be. You're actually looking at live generated code results that ran in a secure sandbox. You can install packages, pass around data. So that's like yet another cool use case that I thought of. And for the sake of time, Shubham, we want to run through the third sample. I won't go with the long explanation, but we can highlight it and show that. So do you want to set up what our third use case is?
Oh yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. That's really the fun one. So we've looked at the single agent. We have looked at the agent writing code, agent with code execution sandbox. But real problems involve multiple stakeholders, where we use multi-agent. And for this demo, we'll be building a multi-agent workflow, parallel researchers, which will lead to a podcast, a voice podcast. So it's multimodal in that nature. We'll be using agent mail for agents to communicate, which will give agents the inbox to communicate with each other. So that's a fun one to see. Then we'll use init to create a workflow and trigger these agents. And then we'll use Cartesia along with that, which is a voice agent platform, which gives voice to the agents to really make these agents talk and create a podcast. So, and we'll have multiple researcher sub agents, each one with its dedicated agent mail inbox. And yeah, now we can get into the demo. Chris, why don't you
Yeah,
show up?
let's do it. Yeah, absolutely. So again, I'll save a lot of the boilerplate because you all are all now like ADK integration experts. When you see the pattern once, you can see how it repeats, and it's all about consistency and helping you develop these things faster. So if I go into our research podcast agent, this one I'll walk through. It basically is using agent mail to give each one of our sub agents their own mailbox, which is a kind of a cool, you think about the problem of how do sub agents talk to each other and store state and information. Well, we've been using email for like 5 decades or so. Like, why not use that for our agents to communicate? So we also plug in to N8N, and there's a number of different ways you could use N8N here. The way that we see it used a lot is, let's make a deterministic workflow. So let's do a bunch of research. We'll use agent mail to talk to each other with the sub agents. And then when we're ready to actually produce a podcast, we can hand that off to an N8N workflow. And you can like point to one or more N8N workflows and triggers, and you can hand it all the information you need. And then it'll generate all of the like speech to text, text to speech and audio files and everything. And speaking of audio files and text to speech, like there's a bunch of tools to do that. Two really cool tools to do that are Cartesia and 11 Labs. So we have integrations for both. Here's the 10 lines you need for Cartesia. And then really the rest of this is just like the orchestration, right? So we have, let's create inboxes for the workers. Let's create 3 researchers that work in parallel. There's a business researcher, a social researcher. They're all communicating via agent mail. And just to give you a peek of like what's going on behind the scenes, right? If I actually look at one of those, some of those inboxes, I think the time, I think I'm filtering wrong by time here, but basically you'll see like all of the agent history of like what messages they sent to each other, and what they were saying at the time. And it's a way for them to collaborate, work together. And then ultimately you'll pass that over to N8N, where you'll have, we've enabled the instance level MCP, and then that'll hand it to Cartesia, where it'll actually generate text to speech, right? So we went from like a pretty, I wouldn't say simple, but like a really capable research agent in GitHub all the way to like a podcast producer with ADK. And all of these things, I would say we're at the point where you can pull these integrations off the shelf and do really, really powerful things. So I'll pause there. I could talk about this for hours, but like hopefully you see the structure and pattern of like of that last podcast agent and how it works.
That is awesome, Chris. I think we covered a lot of ground today. And just to recap, we started with talking about what ADK is, all the way to building a multi-agent parallel researcher that can talk, right? That has a voice and that can create podcasts, end-to-end researcher workflow with GitHub and Hugging Face and Notion. So that's a lot of things. And the good thing is it is really, really easy for you guys to anytime come and watch this live stream, go through this workflow. All you need to do, and again I would repeat, the starting point should be just go to ADK docs, go to coding with AI page, install dev skills or MCP, and just follow up with these prompts. And I think the best thing that you can do, and the interesting and fun part, is you can just tweak the prompts to make these your use cases. You don't have to stick to what we just showed. What we just showed is use them as reference, come up with your own prompts, and you can have like 10, 20, 50 different variations of these use cases. Maybe try to combine different tools with each other. Atlassian with Chroma or Asana with GitLab. Like you can do any number of permutation combinations, which makes it really, really interesting, and which essentially makes ADK an open and flexible ecosystem for you guys to experiment and build whatever you want. So I just want to leave you with this, the ADK docs page, the coding dev skills, and the tools and integration part. Like these are like 2 or 3 links that you need to keep handy to make sure you can build these agents, whatever we showed, and maybe more than that. If you guys like this, we will definitely want to come again and show you more cool agent workflows, more cool agent prototypes. And before we wrap up, we'd love to take some questions here. Uh, let's take the first one here. Uh, wh- so the first question is from YouTube. Chris, when is it best to split tasks into sub-agents? I have a lot of thoughts on this. Why don't you start and then I'll add to that.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think almost every time that our users start with an agent, the best like things that go wrong are when you try to do too many things at the beginning. So if you try to start with a multi-agent system, each with an MCP tool, each with callbacks, like you're probably going to have a bad time because you can't debug that fast enough or understand what's going on behind the scenes. So what we recommend a lot of people is to start simple, really, really simple, and plug in evaluations as early as possible, because there's really no way to tell as you're adding complexity if you're actually helping unless you have some golden standard you're measuring against. And by the way, eval here can be like 5 to 10 prompts. It's not hard to do. So what I would do is start with a single agent, give it a few tools, run that through your evaluation, say like, does this actually do not only this one thing I'm trying to do now, but the next few things I'm trying to do after that? Once you hit that point, you'll start to say, hey, I either need to run these agents in a particular order or this agent's getting overloaded, right? Like it's having a hard time deciding between 20 different tools. So that's a good point to start splitting and making your agents into specialists. So start with a generalist, carve out your specialists. There's different ways of doing that. You can use A to A, agent to agent. You can use agent as tool calls. But like start simple, add something, evaluate, and repeat. And once you get into that iteration cycle, you'll be in a really good place to figure out. And probably you'll end up in a place where you have 3 to 5 sub agents. And that will be like a pretty solid design for that. And if you find yourself getting bigger and bigger, maybe you actually need to split into separate agents and have them talk in a different way. But that's kind of how we recommend kind of starting simple and building out from there.
Yeah, just to add to that, the mental model that I usually follow is it's very simple. When you feel like your agent is doing too much, or when you feel like your agent is too slow, or when you feel your agent is consuming way more tokens than it should. So too far, doing too much is too slow, too expensive, then it's time to really consider splitting your single agent into sub agents. And the other way to look at it would be, and again, this is a fun one, when your prompt starts looking more like a file and less like a paragraph,
Yes.
that's also a time when you should start considering start to consider splitting your agents into multiple sub agents. So those are like a few mental models that you can follow, like super simple, super handy. And of course, what Chris said, you can definitely use evals to make sure you are following more specific technical ways before you're splitting into sub-agents. But if you just have to start, these are like some simple things to start. Like if your agents is doing too much, too slow, too expensive, maybe it's worth considering. Maybe let's do an eval and see if it's worth splitting these the agent into sub-agents. But yeah, that's how we do it. Let's look into another question. Uh, so this is from Jeff on LinkedIn. For a team that already has an existing internal APIs or microservices, what is the golden path for wrapping those as ADK tools? Should we start with the Python SDK for local prototyping or move straight to ADK Web UI for visual orchestration? Um, so I'll just add, if you have internal tools, APIs, and microservices, like ADK provides you different ways to use tools. You can either build your own tools like function tools. You can convert them as MCPs and use it via ADK. You can use existing tools via ADK. And when it comes to, should we start with Python SDK for local prototyping, and or move straight to ADK Web UI? That depends on the approach that you would want to take. If it's a code first approach, I would say, like, if you're developers, I would say start with the SDK. If your team has a mix of low code / no code experience, I would say start with ADK Web UI or Visual Designer. But I'll let Chris add more to it, like what he thinks is the best way, or is there a golden way to add tools to agents?
Yeah, I love this question because it brings in like existing APIs and you're not doing it because the real world, right? There's a bunch of stuff that exists and we have to figure out how to talk to it. What I would say is use whatever is the most motivating and comfortable for you. Look, there's actually so many different ways to solve this problem. You can use an open API spec and hand that directly to ADK. You could build an MCP server tool as an intermediate. You could develop a plugin for ADK. So what I would say is just explore for a little bit and see what's out there. Look at our integrations and see some of them are implemented MCP, some are implemented as plugins. You can look through our skills and it just gives you an idea of what's out there. And then once you have an idea of like, hey, here's 3 ways we could do it, try them very lightly. Pick a couple of routes and existing API routes that you need to talk to, try them. And I think you're very quickly going to latch onto one and it's not going to be universal. Like one team may really like MCP and another team may really like the plugin approach or open API specs. So what I would say not to do is just to like look at our MCP docs and try to start writing that on your own. So you're going to get frustrated and you're not going to learn about the other options that are out there. So look at what people are doing. Maybe take one of our integrations and copy them. It's the beauty of open source. Yeah, pick your favorite one and iterate on that. Once you find a happy path, I think you'll quickly find that like one of the easiest ways to do this is Python functions, right? So you can't beat the simplicity of I write a 1 or 10 line Python function, I add that to my agent and I iterate. Once you do that, you'll find like a nice way to package those and consistently, but most importantly, just get it working. Once you see it working and capable, I think that's good motivation to keep going and package it up further.
Yeah, I would say like that's the easiest way to start. Just like start with the Python functions, and until you break it, that's your way to go.
That's
moving
right.
on, moving on to our next question, maybe the last one. Looking at the time, great session. I'm curious about state management and inter-agent communication at scale. When coordinating 500 plus agents across distributed systems, how do you handle message ordering, idempotency, and failure recovery? Are there specific patterns in ADK for this? First of all, I would say like this question extends beyond this ADK and
Yeah.
goes into the dimension of distributed computing and distributed system management. But I think, Chris, this would be a good question to really, I guess, talk about our protocols blog that recently came up, and maybe we can talk about how A2A helps to connect with these multiple agents, and like what are like some things in A2A which really helps one agent to discover and talk to another agent, and how that could work out at scale. Do you want
Yeah.
to touch base on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question. Deep in my blood is distributed systems. Like in a past life, I used to run HPC clusters with large computational fluid dynamic simulations with 500 nodes, and internode communication was almost always the bottleneck, right? So it's a great question. And I think if I split it into parts, there's like, where is my agent running and what's the runtime? There's the where is the actual heavy lifting and code execution happening, and then there's the inter-agent communication. We could probably spend an entire webinar on that, but I'll give the very quick answer is what we didn't get in today was how do you deploy your agent, right? If you look at the deployment docs in ADK, we actually talk about deploying to Agent Engine, which is a managed agent runtime. On Google Cloud, we have Cloud Run, which is a very battle-tested, scalable way of deploying agents. And we have GKE as a backend. So you can kind of imagine in your head like why you might deploy a certain agent to Agent Engine or a very distributed type of agent to GKE, right? So that's number one. And you can check out the deployment docs for more info and try those out. The second part is about where's the heavy compute running. We showed a little bit of that today with Daytona and some of the other like GKE code executors. Agent Engine has a code executor. Those are all ways that you make sure that you don't overload your main agent with a ton of compute, right? That goes back to what Shubham said. Your agent's probably doing too much and you need to defer that compute elsewhere. You should probably look at code execution plugins and tools. The third part that Shubham brought up is protocols, right? So If you find yourself writing a lot of serialization code and intercommunication with agents, you probably shouldn't. And you should probably defer to a protocol like A to A, which is built into ADK. So it makes it easy to like serve an agent card, and handle exactly what types of cross agent communication that you're doing. Um, but the important thing is to zero in. Is most of your communication happening during agent handoff? Is it happening with long running jobs? And that'll kind of steer you towards like, should I look at agent hosting and scaling that? Should I look at code execution and scaling that? Or should I look at protocols and scaling that? And please don't try to do them all at the same time. You will have a bad time. But profile and find your bottleneck, zero in on that piece, iterate on it, and then zoom back out and kind of repeat. But I really like that question, and it's something our customers are and users are definitely dealing with these like large, whether they're like pharmaceutical or biotech or engineering workloads. It's a really, really good question that at the end of the day, we're running a bunch of code on a bunch of distributed machines, and we need help doing that. But thanks for the question. That's a really awesome question.
That's also a great
Yeah.
answer, Chris. Thank you for that. And I think that's a wrap. Thank you everyone for joining in. It was lovely having you and talking to you, all of you about ADK, going through the integrations ecosystem. Thank you, Chris, for the awesome demos. I think people really loved that. Uh, and before we leave, I just want to leave you with some places where you can go and reproduce this, play with it, have fun with it. Go to ADK Docs, look at the integrations ecosystem. You'll find the links in the YouTube description. And the last thing is that we have Cloud Next coming up next month. So if you haven't checked it out or haven't registered, do so right now. And thank you so much. Thank you again. You guys have a good day, good evening, and take care. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.